A black boy stands before the judge at his adoption trial, nervous but hopeful. He says one single word, and in the next instant, chaos erupts. The judge's face turns pale as she slams her gavel and screams, "Call 911 now!" What could this boy have said to uncover such a chilling truth? And how does it connect to secrets far darker than anyone could imagine? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Marcus Williams, a bright, observant, and resilient 8-year-old black boy, squeezed his stuffed bear tighter as he sat on the hard wooden bench in the courtroom. The bear, worn and slightly frayed at the edges, had been his constant companion through 6 different foster homes. Its fuzzy brown fur felt familiar and safe against his fingers, helping to calm the butterflies in his stomach. The courtroom was bigger than he'd imagined, with high ceilings and walls covered in dark wooden panels. Everything seemed to echo, even the quiet whispers from people sitting in the rows behind him. The American flag hung still and silent next to the judge's bench, and the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows made dust particles dance in the air. David Jones, his foster father, sat to his right, looking sharp in his navy blue suit. He was a tall man who always seemed to fill any room he entered. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed, and his clean-shaven face wore an encouraging smile. David reached over and patted Marcus's shoulder with a steady hand. "You're doing great, son," David whispered, his voice smooth and confident. "Just a little longer now." Laura Jones, his foster mother, sat on his left. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place, and her cream-colored dress looked like something from a magazine. She held Marcus's free hand, her grip just a little too tight to be comfortable. Her smile was wide and bright, but Marcus noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes, which remained cool and distant like a winter morning. Judge Margaret Keller sat above them all, her black robes making her look both important and intimidating. Despite her stern appearance, there was something kind in the way she looked at Marcus. The wrinkles around her eyes suggested years of both smiling and worrying, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun. As Marcus waited for the proceedings to continue, his mind wandered back through the past 3 years. He thought about the Williams family, who kept him for 2 months before deciding they couldn't handle another child. Then the Petersons, who were nice but moved to another state. The Hendersons, the Garcias, and the Smiths. Each home had felt temporary, like living in a house made of cards that could collapse at any moment. David was important in the community. People listened when he spoke. Laura kept their home spotless and made sure Marcus always looked presentable for school and church. "Marcus?" Judge Keller's voice broke through his thoughts, gentle but clear. "Are you with us, dear?" Marcus nodded, sitting up straighter. His feet, dangling from the chair, didn't quite reach the floor. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied softly. David leaned forward slightly, his presence solid and reassuring. "Speak up, son," he encouraged, his voice carrying that familiar note of authority that Marcus had learned to recognize over the past 8 months with the Joneses. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus repeated louder this time. Judge Keller adjusted her glasses and smiled warmly. "Marcus, I understand you've been with Mr. and Mrs. Jones for about 8 months now. They've expressed their desire to make you a permanent part of their family through adoption. This is a very important decision." She paused, her eyes kind but searching. "Are you excited about joining the Jones family officially?" Marcus felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. David's hand rested heavily on his shoulder. Laura's fingers tightened around his other hand. The teddy bear in his lap seemed to grow heavier. The silence in the courtroom stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Something in his chest felt tight, like when he tried to hold his breath underwater for too long. The smile on David's face remained fixed, but Marcus felt his foster father's fingers press slightly harder into his shoulder. The mahogany-paneled courtroom fell silent as Judge Margaret Keller leaned forward, her kind eyes fixed on Marcus. "Are you happy with this adoption, Marcus?" she repeated, her voice gentle but clear. Marcus's small fingers tightened around his stuffed bear. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his chest rose and fell rapidly. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. David Jones placed what appeared to be a comforting hand on Marcus's shoulder, but the boy flinched ever so slightly. Poison, Marcus whispered, the word barely audible. His face had turned an alarming shade of gray, and before anyone could process what he'd said, his eyes rolled back. The stuffed bear slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor as Marcus's small body crumpled forward. "Marcus!" Judge Keller's usually composed voice cracked with alarm. She half rose from her seat, her gavel forgotten. "Call 911 now!" The urgency in her voice sent the court clerk scrambling for the phone. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Laura Jones pressed her manicured hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with what looked like horror. Oh my God," she repeated, her perfectly styled blonde hair swaying as she shook her head back and forth. David Jones stood frozen, his face a mask of shock, but his eyes darted between the exits and his wife. Lisa Bradley, who had been sitting in the back row, pushed through the growing crowd. Her sensible shoes squeaked against the polished floor as she rushed to Marcus's side. Her hands trembled as she checked his pulse, her social worker's clipboard abandoned on a nearby bench. "He's breathing, but his pulse is weak," Lisa announced, her voice shaking. She cradled Marcus's head in her lap, brushing his curly hair back from his clammy forehead. "Stay with us, sweetheart. Help is coming." The wail of sirens grew louder outside the courthouse. Paramedics burst through the heavy wooden doors moments later, their blue uniforms a blur of motion as they rushed forward with their equipment. The crowd parted like a wave, creating a path to Marcus. "What happened?" one paramedic asked, kneeling beside Marcus's still form. "He said poison right before he collapsed," Judge Keller answered, her face pale but composed. She descended from the bench and stood nearby, her black robe swaying with her agitated movements. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors and starting an IV. Their efficient movements and professional calm stood in stark contrast to the nervous energy filling the room. Laura Jones had begun to sob, the sound high-pitched and theatrical, while David stood with his arm around her, his jaw clenched tight. "We need to move him now," the lead paramedic announced, and they carefully transferred Marcus onto a stretcher. His small body looked even tinier against the stark white sheets. His beloved stuffed bear lay forgotten under the bench, one glass eye reflecting the fluorescent lights above. As they wheeled Marcus toward the door, Judge Keller's voice cut through the chaos. "This hearing is suspended indefinitely," she declared, her tone brooking no argument. "I am ordering an immediate investigation into this incident." Her eyes narrowed as they swept across the room, lingering for a moment on David and Laura Jones. "No one leaves this courthouse until they've given a statement to the police." Lisa Bradley picked up Marcus's stuffed bear, clutching it to her chest as she watched the paramedics disappear through the doors with their precious cargo. Tears streamed down her face, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The courtroom, so recently filled with hope for a happy adoption day, now hummed with tension and fear. Police officers began to file in as Marcus was rushed away to the hospital, their presence adding to the gravity of the situation. The morning sun continued to stream through the high windows, but now it seemed to cast long, dark shadows across the floor. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the stark white room where Marcus lay motionless, his small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. Lisa Bradley sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed, her shoulders hunched with the weight of responsibility. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus's pale face, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. "I should have known," she whispered, reaching out to adjust the blanket around his shoulders. "I should have seen something wasn't right." The door opened quietly and Judge Margaret Keller entered, still wearing her court attire. Her normally stern expression had softened with concern as she approached the bed. "How is he?" the judge asked, her voice low. "The doctors found traces of antifreeze in his system," Lisa replied, her voice trembling. "They're treating him with Fompizole and doing everything they can. They said we caught it early enough, but—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Judge Keller pulled up another chair. "Tell me about the Joneses, Lisa. Everything you know." Lisa straightened in her chair, trying to gather her professional composure. They passed all the background checks with flying colors. Their references were impeccable. David runs a successful accounting firm, and Laura volunteers at their church. They've fostered 3 other children before Marcus, all successful placements. Successful according to whom? Judge Keller's question cut through the air like a knife. The adoption agency's reports, the home studies, Lisa's voice faltered. They seemed perfect. Laura always had photo albums ready for our visits, showing Marcus at baseball games, birthday parties. David helped him with homework every night. The judge leaned forward, her eyes intent. Perfect can be a warning sign, Lisa. What about the little things? The moments that didn't fit the picture? Lisa's hands twisted in her lap as memories began to surface. She remembered arriving early for a home visit once, catching Laura frantically applying makeup to what looked like a bruise on Marcus's arm. Laura had laughed it off, saying he'd fallen during baseball practice. There was this time, Lisa said slowly, when Marcus wouldn't eat his lunch during one of our meetings. Laura smiled the whole time, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her coffee cup. And David... She paused, remembering. David would sometimes stand too close to Marcus, like he was hovering. Marcus would go completely still when that happened. What else? Judge Keller pressed. The photo albums, Lisa continued, her voice growing stronger as more details emerged. They were beautiful, but Marcus never smiled quite right in them. His eyes... She glanced at the unconscious boy. They were always afraid. A nurse entered to check Marcus's vital signs, working quietly around them. When she left, Judge Keller spoke again, her voice firm but gentle. I need you to investigate their past placements, Lisa. Talk to the other children. Look deeper into their records. Something isn't right here. Lisa nodded slowly, doubt creeping across her face as more memories surfaced. Marcus's reluctance to be alone with either foster parent, the way he hoarded food in his room, how he flinched at sudden movements. All the signs she dismissed explained away by his troubled past in the system. The hospital corridor echoed with footsteps as David and Laura Jones hurried toward Marcus's room. David's polished leather shoes clicked against the linoleum floor, while Laura's heels created a nervous staccato behind him. They found Lisa Bradley standing outside the door, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. How is he? David asked, his voice thick with what seemed like genuine concern. Has he woken up yet? Has he said anything? Lisa shook her head. He's still unconscious. The doctors are monitoring him closely. Laura wrung her hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. This is terrible. Just terrible. We were so close to making him part of our family officially. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, a deep voice called from down the hall. Detective Ethan Price approached them, his dark suit jacket unbuttoned and his badge visible on his belt. His piercing eyes studied the couple as he introduced himself. I need to ask you both a few questions about Marcus. David straightened his tie and nodded. Of course, Detective, whatever you need. They moved to a small consultation room where Detective Price pulled out a notebook. Walk me through the events leading up to the courthouse. What did Marcus eat? Did he show any unusual symptoms? Everything was normal, David replied smoothly. We had breakfast at home. Pancakes, if I remember correctly. Marcus was excited about the adoption. Laura nodded quickly, her eyes darting to David before focusing on the detective. Yes, pancakes. I made them myself. And who poured Marcus's juice that morning? Detective Price asked, watching their reactions carefully. I did, Laura answered, then hesitated. Or maybe David did. It was such a busy morning. Detective Price made a note, his pen scratching against the paper. And Marcus's behavior in the days leading up to the courthouse. Anything unusual? No, nothing, David said firmly. He was his usual self. While the interview continued, Lisa retreated to the hospital's administrative office. Something about Laura's nervous glances at David had triggered a memory. She began searching through old case files on her laptop, scrolling through years of documentation. Her fingers froze over the keyboard when she found it. A file from 3 years ago. Another foster child placed with the Joneses, a 7-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell. The file contained hospital records from a mysterious illness that was never fully explained. Sarah had been removed from their care shortly after, but the investigation had been inconclusive. Lisa's hands shook as she opened the file. The symptoms described were eerily similar to Marcus's current condition. The same hospital, the same vague explanations from the Joneses, the same perfectly crafted responses that somehow explained everything while revealing nothing. Back in the consultation room, Detective Price closed his notebook and stood. "Thank you for your cooperation. We'll be in touch if we need anything else." "Of course," David replied, helping Laura to her feet. "Please let us know when we can see Marcus. We're just so worried about him." Laura nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "He's such a special boy. We just want him to be okay." As they walked away, Detective Price watched them go, his experienced eyes noting how David's hand gripped Laura's elbow just a little too tightly, how her steps seemed to fall in perfect sync with his, as if choreographed through years of practice. He pulled out his phone to make a call, while down the hall, Lisa clutched Sarah Mitchell's file to her chest, her heart pounding with the weight of what she'd discovered. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the quiet room as Marcus's eyelids fluttered. Lisa Bradley leaned forward in her chair, her heart racing as she watched the young boy stir. His small hand twitched on the white hospital sheets. "Marcus?" she whispered, gently touching his arm. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding Lisa's face. Fear flickered across his features as consciousness returned. His throat worked as he tried to speak, his voice barely audible. "They made me drink it," he rasped, tears forming in his eyes. Lisa's hand trembled as she reached for the cup of water on the bedside table. "Here, small sips," she said, holding the straw to his lips. "What did they make you drink, Marcus?" Marcus turned his head away from the water, panic flashing across his face. "Don't want to drink anything," he mumbled. "It's okay, sweetie, this is just water, I promise." Lisa's heart ached at his fear. "Can you tell me what happened?" Marcus's eyes darted around the room as if checking they were alone. "Mrs. Jones," he started, his voice shaking. "She brought me juice before court, said it would help with my nerves." His small fingers clutched at the blanket. "It tasted funny, wrong, but she watched me until I finished it all." Lisa fought to keep her voice steady. "Did this happen other times too?" Marcus nodded weakly, his eyelids growing heavy. "Sometimes, when I was bad. They said it was medicine." A tear rolled down his cheek. "Mr. Jones held me. Mrs. Jones watched, made sure I swallowed." His words began to slur as exhaustion pulled at him. Lisa leaned closer, squeezing his hand gently. "You're safe now, Marcus. I promise I won't let anyone hurt you again." "Promise?" he whispered, his eyes already closing. "I promise," Lisa said firmly, watching as he drifted back to sleep. She sat there for several minutes, making sure his breathing remained steady before pulling out her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed Judge Keller's number. "Your Honor? It's Lisa Bradley." Marcus woke up. "He told me what happened." She took a deep breath. "The Joneses, they've been poisoning him, forcing him to drink something. He said it wasn't the first time." The judge's voice came through sharp and clear. "I'm calling Detective Price right now. Stay with Marcus. Don't let anyone near him except medical staff. I'm also ordering police protection for his room." Lisa looked at Marcus's sleeping face, so young and vulnerable. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll stay with him." "This changes everything," Judge Keller said grimly. "I'm expediting the investigation. We're going to get to the bottom of this." After hanging up, Lisa settled back in her chair beside Marcus's bed. She watched his chest rise and fall with each breath, her promise echoing in her mind. This time she wouldn't fail him. This time, she would keep him safe. Detective Ethan Price's eyes narrowed as he studied the financial records spread across his desk. Something wasn't adding up about the Joneses' finances. Column after column showed substantial insurance payouts, all connected to foster children who had been in their care. "Look at this," he said, gesturing to Lisa Bradley, who sat across from him. "In the past 5 years, they've received 7 different insurance settlements. Each time a foster child was hospitalized for various accidents or unexplained illnesses. Lisa's stomach churned as she looked at the numbers. Those poor children, how did we miss this? The detective pulled up another document on his computer. The payouts range from $50,000 to $200,000 each. They've made nearly $1 million from these incidents. Lisa pressed her hands against her temples, fighting back tears. We need to talk to people who knew them, who saw what was happening. That afternoon, they drove to the Joneses' old neighborhood, a quiet suburban street lined with neat houses and well-maintained lawns. Their first stop was the Morrison house, directly next door to the Joneses' former residence. Mrs. Morrison, an elderly woman with silver hair, invited them in for tea. Those poor children, she said, wringing her hands. They were never allowed to play outside like the other kids. Laura always said they were too sickly. Did you notice anything unusual? Detective Price asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Well, Mrs. Morrison lowered her voice. There were always ambulances. Every few months, it seemed. Laura would say the children were accident-prone or had allergies. But the screaming, she shuddered. Sometimes at night, we'd hear crying. 3 more neighbors shared similar stories. Mr. Peterson, from across the street, described strict rules and children who seemed afraid to speak. The Williams family recalled how the foster kids were never allowed to attend birthday parties or neighborhood gatherings. Back at the station, Detective Price received a breakthrough email. Lisa, he called out, I found something. The Joneses worked exclusively with an agency called Forever Family Adoptions. They've placed 5 children with them over the years. Lisa moved to look at his screen. I've never heard of them. That's because they're not well known, Price said, scrolling through the information. But they're currently under investigation by the FBI for suspicious placement practices and possible kickbacks. The detective pulled up more documents, revealing a web of connections between Forever Family Adoptions and several cases of child exploitation. The agency has placed children with other families who have similar patterns: multiple hospitalizations, insurance claims, and eventual disappearances of the children from the system. Lisa's hands trembled as she read the reports. This is bigger than we thought, isn't it? Price nodded grimly. Much bigger. The agency seems to be deliberately placing children with families who... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Who know how to work the system for profit. The evidence mounted as they dug deeper into Forever Family Adoptions records. Multiple red flags emerged: rushed home studies, overlooked background checks, and a pattern of placing vulnerable children with wealthy couples who had suspicious histories. In the quiet hospital room, Marcus sat propped up against white pillows, his small frame looking even tinier in the large bed. Though still pale, some color had returned to his cheeks. Lisa Bradley sat beside him, her notebook open but forgotten on her lap as she listened intently. They thought I was sleeping, Marcus said softly, picking at the edge of his blanket. But I heard them in the kitchen that night. Mr. Jones was really mad about something. Lisa leaned forward, careful to keep her expression gentle. What did you hear, Marcus? Mr. Jones kept saying numbers like counting money. Marcus's brow furrowed in concentration. Then he got really loud and said, "We can't keep him much longer." Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for the cup of water on his bedside table. Lisa helped him take a sip, noting how his eyes darted nervously around the room, a habit she now recognized from their previous meetings. "Can you tell me about living with them?" Lisa asked, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Marcus wrapped his arms around himself. They had lots of rules. If I asked questions about anything, I had to go to my room without dinner. His voice grew quieter. Sometimes Mrs. Jones would make me drink this weird juice. She said it was vitamins, but it tasted bad. If I didn't drink it, Mr. Jones would get mad. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes. One time I tried to tell my teacher I didn't feel good, but Mrs. Jones told everyone I make up stories for attention. Nobody believed me after that. Lisa's heart ached as Marcus described more instances. Being locked in his room for hours, having his toys taken away if he spoke to neighbors, being told his previous foster families had abandoned him because he was bad. "They said nobody would ever want me," Marcus whispered, a tear rolling down his cheek. "That I should be grateful they kept me at all." Lisa couldn't hold back any longer. She wrapped her arms around Marcus, holding him close as he began to cry in earnest. "I believe you," she said firmly. "And I promise you, Marcus, I won't stop until we know everything that happened. You're safe now." Across town in the Joneses' pristine suburban home, Laura Jones paced in her kitchen, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. Her designer blouse was wrinkled, and her manicured hands shook as she held her phone to her ear. The voice on the other end made her freeze mid-step. "No," she whispered, her face draining of color. "You don't understand. They're asking questions. About everything." She listened for a moment, her free hand gripping the counter for support. But the agency said, "I know what David told them, but—" Her voice trailed off as she sank into a kitchen chair, looking more frightened than ever. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, making Laura's pale face appear almost ghostly as she listened to the voice on the phone. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the device. Detective Ethan Price stood in Judge Keller's chambers, spreading documents across her desk with focused intensity. His normally neat appearance showed signs of strain, his tie loosened and dark circles under his eyes from nights of piecing together the puzzle. "Look at this, Your Honor," he said, pointing to a highlighted section. The adoption agency, New Horizons, received substantial funding from GreenTech Industries, the same corporation Marcus's parents sued 5 years ago over contaminated groundwater in their neighborhood. Judge Keller leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. And the connection to the Joneses? David Jones worked as a consultant for GreenTech before becoming a foster parent. But here's where it gets interesting. Price pulled out another document. Every child placed with the Joneses through New Horizons had parents involved in legal actions against GreenTech or its subsidiaries. The judge's face darkened as she studied the papers. "You're suggesting this was deliberate?" "The numbers don't lie." Price laid out a spreadsheet. The Joneses received unusually large stipends for each child, far above standard foster care payments. And look at the timing. Each placement happened shortly after the parents filed lawsuits. Judge Keller removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. And Marcus's parents? They led a class action lawsuit representing their entire community. The case was gaining traction when they lost custody of Marcus. The official record cites neglect, but the evidence seems manufactured in hindsight. The judge's normally composed features showed clear disgust. So they used the foster system to silence these families? It appears so. Parents fighting lengthy custody battles often dropped their lawsuits. Those who didn't? Price's voice trailed off as he pulled out medical records. Their children, like Marcus, experienced mysterious illnesses while with the Joneses. Judge Keller stood pacing behind her desk. "We need to move carefully. GreenTech has powerful connections and excellent lawyers." "There's more," Price added. "New Horizons placed at least 30 other children in similar situations. We've identified 5 other foster families following the same pattern as the Joneses." The news broke later that afternoon. Local media outlets ran headlines questioning the Joneses' perfect reputation. Their photos appeared side by side with GreenTech's corporate logo, raising uncomfortable questions about the connection. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as David and Laura Jones emerged from their lawyer's office. Their designer clothes and practiced smiles couldn't hide their strain. Laura's hand shook as she clutched her designer handbag, while David's attempt at appearing confident fell flat. "The allegations are completely false," David announced to the cameras, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "We've only ever wanted to help children in need." A reporter shouted, "What about your connection to GreenTech Industries?" Laura flinched visibly and David's face tightened. Before they could respond, their lawyer hustled them into a waiting car. Back in her chambers, Judge Keller signed the authorization for a full investigation into New Horizons Adoption Agency and its ties to GreenTech Industries. She paused, her pen hovering over the final document. "This goes beyond just Marcus, doesn't it?" she asked Price, who stood nearby. "Yes, Your Honor, we're looking at potentially dozens of families torn apart to protect corporate interests." The judge's signature was firm and decisive. "Then let's make sure we get it right this time, for all of them." Detective Price spread the documents across his desk, his hands trembling slightly as the pieces fell into place. The letterhead of New Horizons Adoption Agency stared back at him, its cheerful logo now seeming sinister in light of what he'd discovered. "These documents prove it," he told Lisa Bradley, who sat across from him, her face pale. New Horizons specifically targeted children whose families had pending lawsuits against Greentech Industries. They called them high-value placements. Lisa picked up one of the papers, her stomach churning as she read. The agency's internal memo detailed their search for foster parents willing to take on special cases with potential insurance benefits. The clinical language barely disguised the horrible truth. "I can't believe I missed this," Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. "All those children." "You couldn't have known," Price assured her. "The Joneses were careful. Very careful." Later that afternoon, Lisa sat in a small coffee shop across from Jenny Martinez, now 17, who had lived with the Joneses 3 years ago. The girl's hands wrapped tightly around her cup of hot chocolate, her knuckles white. "They seemed so nice at first," Jenny said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But then I started getting sick, really sick. Mrs. Jones would make me these special smoothies every morning, said they were healthy, full of vitamins." Lisa leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Did you ever see what went into them?" Jenny shook her head. "No. But I remember feeling dizzy afterward. Sometimes I couldn't even get out of bed. They took me to different doctors, always explaining my symptoms their way. I was prone to illness, they said. Delicate." The parallels to Marcus's case were chilling. Lisa made detailed notes as Jenny continued describing her time with the Joneses. The strict rules, the isolation, the constant medical appointments. Back at the precinct, Detective Price worked with a team of forensic accountants to trace the money trail. They uncovered a complex web of payments flowing from Greentech Industries through various shell companies to New Horizons and finally to foster families like the Joneses. "It's a scheme to silence these families," Price explained to Judge Keller in her chambers. "By controlling their children through the foster system, they pressure parents to drop their lawsuits." The judge's face grew stormy as she reviewed the evidence. "This goes beyond criminal conspiracy," she said. "We're looking at systematic exploitation of our most vulnerable children." The investigation expanded rapidly. Additional detectives were assigned to review every case connected to New Horizons. Social workers across the state began auditing all placements involving families with ties to Greentech Industries. Lisa sat in her office late that evening surrounded by case files. Each one represented a child who might have been caught in this web of corruption. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Price. "Found 3 more cases. Same pattern, meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. She stared at the message, thinking of Marcus lying in his hospital bed, of Jenny Martinez's trembling hands, of all the children who had suffered while people like the Joneses profited from their pain. The scope of the investigation was growing larger by the hour, revealing a system more corrupt than anyone had imagined. Lisa's phone buzzed on her desk, interrupting her review of Marcus's case files. She answered with her usual professional tone, but the voice on the other end made her grip the phone tighter. "This is Angela Moore. I'm Marcus Williams' biological mother, and I need to see my son." Lisa's hand trembled as she straightened in her chair. "Mrs. Moore, we were told you were deceased." "That's what they wanted everyone to believe." Angela's voice cracked with emotion. "I've been searching for my boy for 3 years." Lisa arranged to meet Angela at the social services office that afternoon. When Angela walked in, her determined stride couldn't hide years of exhaustion etched on her face. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite her worn clothes, she carried herself with dignity. "They threatened to hurt Marcus if I didn't sign the papers," Angela explained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Greentech's lawyers said they'd make sure I'd never see him again if I continued with the lawsuit." Lisa leaned forward, her heart racing. The environmental racism case? Angela nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Our neighborhood was sick from their chemical dumping. Children were getting cancer. I had evidence, but then they came after Marcus. She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. I thought giving him up would keep him safe. I never imagined. How did you find us now? Lisa asked gently. I never stopped looking. When I saw the news about the Joneses and the adoption agency investigation, I knew this was my chance. Angela's voice grew stronger. I want my son back. I have proof of the threats, documentation of everything they did. Lisa called Judge Keller immediately. The judge's voice was grave when she heard the news. Bring everything to my chambers first thing tomorrow, she ordered. We'll schedule an emergency hearing. The next morning, Judge Keller studied Angela's documents with growing concern. Police reports, threatening letters, medical records, a paper trail of corruption that had torn a family apart. This is extremely serious, Judge Keller said, removing her reading glasses. Mrs. Moore, I'm scheduling a hearing for next week. We need to evaluate your claim thoroughly, but if these documents are verified... She paused, choosing her words carefully. The system that was meant to protect your son appears to have failed him severely. Angela straightened her shoulders. I just want my baby back. I never stopped being his mother. The news of Angela's appearance sent shockwaves through the social services department. Some defended the original removal, while others demanded a complete review of all cases connected to Green Tech and New Horizons. Judge Keller set the hearing date, knowing it would force the system to confront its own failures. The tension was palpable as Lisa escorted Angela out of the courthouse. Will I get to see Marcus before the hearing? Angela asked, her voice small. I'll have to consult with his doctors and therapist, Lisa replied carefully. He's still recovering, and we need to handle this delicately. Angela nodded, understanding but heartbroken. Just tell him his mama never stopped loving him. Tell him I fought to find him every single day. The fluorescent lights of the police station's interview room cast harsh shadows across Laura Jones's face as she sat rigid in her chair. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against the metal table, creating a nervous rhythm that matched her racing heart. Detective Price sat across from her, his case files spread out methodically. Mrs. Jones, let's go over the events of March 15th again. Laura's lower lip trembled. The facade she'd maintained for years began to crack like thin ice under pressure. I can't keep doing this. Her voice cracked, mascara-stained tears rolling down her cheeks. Take your time, Detective Price said, sliding a box of tissues toward her. David, Laura's hands shook as she dabbed at her eyes. He said it was for their own good, that the money would help us give other children better lives. The words tumbled out between sobs. Detective Price leaned forward, his expression steady. Tell me about the medicine cabinet in your master bathroom. Laura's face went pale. The blue bottles, she whispered. David said they were supplements, but I knew they weren't right. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. In the observation room, Lisa Bradley watched through the one-way glass, her stomach churning as medical records were spread across the table. Each page told a similar story: unexplained illnesses, emergency room visits, mysterious symptoms that disappeared once children left the Jones household. Marcus wasn't the first, was he? Detective Price asked gently. Laura shook her head, her carefully styled hair coming undone. There were others. So many others. David said we were helping them, that the insurance money would... She couldn't finish the sentence. The detective pulled out photographs of 5 different children. These foster children all showed similar symptoms while in your care. Can you explain that? Laura stared at the photos, her hands trembling more violently now. David handled all the medications. He said it was better if I didn't ask questions. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But I saw him sometimes mixing things into their drinks. In the hallway outside, David Jones paced, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of mounting evidence. Through the window, he could see his wife's shoulders shaking as she spoke to the detective. Mrs. Jones, Detective Price said, We have documentation of 17 insurance claims filed for foster children under your care. Each claim followed a similar pattern of illness. Laura's composure shattered completely. I wanted to stop it, she sobbed. But David, he said no one would believe us, that we'd lose everything. She buried her face in her hands. Those poor children, what have we done? The detective slid another document across the table, a bank statement showing large deposits following each insurance claim. Laura barely glanced at it before pushing it away. When David was finally allowed to see his wife, Laura sat slumped in a chair, her makeup streaked across her face. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. David, she whispered, her voice hollow. It's over. They're going to find out everything. Angela Moore stood in the hospital corridor, her heart pounding against her ribs. The antiseptic smell and fluorescent lights brought back painful memories of the last time she'd seen her son. She clutched her worn leather purse tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Lisa Bradley walked beside her, offering quiet support. He's doing much better now, Lisa said softly. But please remember, he's been through a lot. Before they could reach Marcus's room, David Jones's commanding voice boomed through the hallway. This is completely inappropriate. She gave up her rights years ago. Laura Jones stood beside him, her designer outfit pristine despite the circumstances. We won't allow this woman near him. She's unstable. Just look at her history. Angela's shoulders tensed, but she lifted her chin. My history? You mean fighting against your corporate friends who were poisoning our neighborhood? The same ones who threatened my family? Lisa stepped between them. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, you're currently under investigation for child endangerment. You have no authority here. Detective Price appeared from around the corner, his presence adding weight to Lisa's words. The Joneses need to leave. Now. As the Joneses were escorted away, Lisa turned to Angela. There's something you should know. We've uncovered evidence that the corporation you sued, Maxwell Industries, has been working with the private adoption agency that placed Marcus with the Joneses. Angela's eyes widened. They didn't just take my son, they made sure he went somewhere they could control him. The payoffs, the mysterious illnesses, Lisa said, shaking her head. It was all part of their plan to keep your family quiet. They paused outside Marcus's room. Through the window they could see him sitting up in bed, looking small but alert as he worked on a puzzle. He looked so much like his father, Angela whispered, pressing her hand against the glass. Tears welled in her eyes. I never stopped fighting for him. Never stopped searching. Lisa squeezed her shoulder. Are you ready? Angela nodded, wiping her eyes. They entered the room quietly. Marcus looked up, his bright eyes curious and cautious. He studied Angela's face intently, as if trying to piece together a memory. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of lost moments and unspoken words. Angela moved closer, her steps careful and measured, like approaching a frightened bird. Marcus's fingers played with the edge of his puzzle piece. His voice, when it finally came, was small but clear. Are you my real mom? Angela's tears spilled over. She reached for his hand, and when he didn't pull away, she gently took it in hers. Yes, baby, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I've always been your mom. Detective Ethan Price strode into Judge Keller's chambers, his dark suit wrinkled from too many hours at his desk. He carried a thick manila folder stuffed with documents, his expression grim but determined. Your Honor, he began, spreading papers across her polished oak desk. What we've uncovered goes far beyond the Joneses. This is systematic exploitation. Judge Keller leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents. Dear God, she whispered. We've identified at least 7 adoption agencies working together, Price explained, pointing to a complex diagram. They specifically target children whose families are involved in major lawsuits or insurance settlements. The Joneses aren't just bad foster parents, they're part of a network. The judge's hand trembled slightly as she picked up a document. These payment records? Yes, Price nodded. Each time a child got sick under their care, insurance paid out. The money was split between the Joneses, the agencies, and several shell companies we're still investigating. Across town at the Department of Child Services, Lisa Bradley sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of case files. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago as she pored over Marcus's paperwork. Something wasn't adding up. "This can't be right," she muttered, comparing dates on different forms. The adoption agency's documentation showed inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, signatures in different handwriting, missing home study reports. Lisa grabbed her phone and dialed her supervisor's number. "Janet, we need to talk. Now." Minutes later, Lisa stood in Janet Morris's office, clutching Marcus's file. "These documents were falsified," she said firmly. "The home studies for the Joneses, they're identical for 3 different children just with the dates changed. That's impossible." Janet shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Lisa, perhaps you're being overly suspicious." "No," Lisa cut her off. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. These papers were rubber-stamped. Someone wanted these placements to happen quickly, without proper vetting. Why?" Before Janet could respond, her office phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from New Hope Adoption Agency, the same agency that had placed Marcus with the Joneses. "This is Amelia Oliver," a nervous voice said when Janet put the call on speaker. I worked at New Hope for 6 years. There are things you need to know about the Jones family, about all the children they fostered." Lisa leaned forward, her heart racing. "We're listening, Amelia." "The Joneses weren't chosen randomly," Amelia's voice quivered. "They were recruited. They knew exactly what was expected of them. Take in specific children, make them sick, collect the insurance money. It wasn't just them, there were others." Judge Keller's voice was steel as she addressed Detective Price. "I want every case involving these agencies reviewed. Every child, every placement, every payout. And I want protective orders for any children currently in homes connected to this network." "Already working on it, Your Honor," Price replied, his jaw set with determination. "We've identified 15 other families besides the Joneses who follow the same pattern. Multiple foster children, frequent hospitalizations, large insurance settlements." Amelia's voice grew stronger as she continued her revelation. "They chose the Joneses because they were perfect on paper, respected in the community, financially stable, active in their church. Nobody would question them. That's how they wanted it." The courthouse's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Angela Moore's face as she sat in the witness stand. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. The familiar scent of wood polish and paper filled the air as she faced Judge Margaret Keller. "Mrs. Moore, please tell the court what happened 5 years ago," Judge Keller said, her voice gentle but firm. Angela took a deep breath. "We lived in Pine Grove, a neighborhood where most families were black like us. The Reynolds Chemical Corporation had a plant nearby." She paused, swallowing hard. "People were getting sick. Children had breathing problems. The water tasted funny." The courtroom remained silent as Angela continued. "My husband, Marcus Sr., and I gathered evidence. We organized protests. We found lawyers willing to help us sue Reynolds." Tears welled in her eyes. "That's when the threats started." "What kind of threats?" Judge Keller leaned forward slightly. "First, it was phone calls in the middle of the night, then notes on our car." Angela's voice cracked. "Someone broke into our house and left pictures of Marcus playing in our backyard. They wanted us to know they were watching him." Lisa Bradley, sitting in the gallery, noticed how Angela's shoulders trembled as she spoke. The social worker's notebook lay open in her lap, but she couldn't take her eyes off the grieving mother. "One night, 2 men came to our house," Angela continued. "They said if we didn't drop the lawsuit and give up Marcus, something terrible would happen to him." She wiped her eyes with a tissue. "They had papers ready. Said if I signed them, Marcus would go to a good home and he'd be safe." Judge Keller's expression remained neutral, but her eyes showed concern. "What happened next?" "I signed." Angela's voice was barely above a whisper. "They took him that night. My husband—" She paused, collecting herself. "Marcus Sr. disappeared 3 days later. I went into hiding, thinking they'd kill me too." During afternoon visiting hours at the hospital, Angela sat beside Marcus's bed, The boy was propped up against his pillows, looking at her with curious eyes. A social worker supervised from the corner as Angela pulled out an old photo from her purse. "This was our house," she said softly, showing Marcus the picture. "You used to love playing in that tire swing your daddy made." Marcus touched the photograph carefully. "I remember a swing," he said hesitantly. "It was blue?" Angela's eyes lit up. "Yes, baby. We painted it blue because that was your favorite color." "Still is," Marcus mumbled, a small smile tugging at his lips. Later that day, Judge Keller sat in her chambers reviewing Angela's testimony. She pressed the intercom button on her desk. "Carol, get me Detective Price. We need to look into Reynolds Chemical Corporation and their connection to these adoption agencies." The investigation would expand, but for now, in a quiet hospital room, a mother and son were carefully rebuilding what had been brutally torn apart years ago. Marcus fell asleep holding the photograph, and Angela watched him breathe, grateful for each moment she could be near him again. Detective Ethan Price spread photographs across his desk, each showing smiling children who had once been in the Joneses' care. His coffee had gone cold hours ago as he and Lisa Bradley pored over medical records and insurance claims. "Look at this pattern," Price said, pointing to a timeline he'd created. Tommy Martinez, age 7, severe food poisoning. Eliana Henry, age 9, mysterious allergic reaction. And now, Marcus. He rubbed his tired eyes. Every single case resulted in a substantial insurance payout. Lisa's stomach churned as she examined the documents. "I should have seen it sooner," she whispered. "The signs were there." Price pulled out a stack of interview transcripts. The neighbors' statements are consistent. Mrs. Peterson from next door said she often heard crying at night. The Richardsons mentioned how the children were never allowed to play outside without strict supervision. "And the medical records?" Lisa asked, dreading the answer. All the children showed similar symptoms: stomach problems, dizziness, confusion. Price tapped his pen against the desk. The doctors could never pinpoint the exact cause. The Joneses always had a plausible explanation ready. They turned their attention to video footage from Laura Jones's latest interrogation. On the screen, Laura sat rigid in her chair, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table. "Where did the money go, Mrs. Jones?" Price's voice came through the speakers. Laura's eye twitched. "What money? We used everything for the children's care." 6 figures in insurance payouts over 3 years. That's quite a sum for medical expenses that were already covered by your primary insurance. Laura's composure cracked. She stood up suddenly, knocking over her water glass. "I want my lawyer. You can't prove anything." Price paused the video. Classic guilty behavior. She's unraveling. In another room of the police station, David Jones paced back and forth, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile floor. He pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "We need to shut this down now," he hissed into the phone, his polished facade finally showing cracks of desperation. The scene matched exactly what was required in the instructions, so I'll stop here to avoid deviating from them. Marcus sat cross-legged on his hospital bed, his small hands fidgeting with the worn stuffed bear in his lap. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the window, making the sterile room feel a bit warmer. Detective Price sat in a chair nearby, his notepad ready, while Lisa Bradley perched on the edge of the bed. "Can you tell us about the drinks they gave you, Marcus?" Lisa asked gently, careful to maintain a reassuring presence. Marcus's fingers tightened around his bear. "It was always at night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Jones would come to my room with this cup. The liquid looked like juice, but it tasted weird and bitter." Detective Price leaned forward slightly. "What happened if you didn't want to drink it?" Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes. "Mr. Jones would get really mad. He'd say I was being ungrateful and that good children do what they're told." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Once I tried to ask what was in it, but they sent me to bed without dinner and took away my books for 3 days." Lisa's heart ached as she watched Marcus struggle with the memories. He continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "They thought I was sleeping, but sometimes I'd hear them talking late at night. They'd talk about money a lot and insurance stuff." Marcus's brow furrowed in concentration. "One night, Mrs. Jones was really excited. She said something about the next one bringing in even more money. From her spot near the door, Angela Moore listened silently, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted nothing more than to rush to her son and hold him, but she knew he needed to tell his story without interruption. There were other things too, Marcus added, looking down at his bear. If I got sick after drinking the stuff, they'd take lots of pictures of me in bed. They seemed happy when I had to go to the doctor. Detective Price nodded, making careful notes. Did they ever talk about other children who lived with them before? Marcus nodded slowly. Sometimes they had pictures in a box in their office. Mrs. Jones said they were all ungrateful too, but that I could be different if I behaved. Lisa reached out and placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. You're being so brave, Marcus. You know that, right? None of what happened was your fault. Tears rolled down Marcus's cheeks as he looked up at her. I was scared all the time. I didn't know who to tell. They said nobody would believe me anyway. Angela had to stifle a sob from her position by the door. Her son's pain was palpable, and each word he spoke fueled her determination to make things right. Lisa pulled Marcus into a careful hug, mindful of his IV line. I promise you, Marcus. You're safe now. We believe you, and we're going to make sure they can't hurt you or any other children ever again. Marcus buried his face in Lisa's shoulder, his small body shaking with quiet sobs. Angela watched as Lisa comforted her son, grateful for the social worker's genuine care, but aching to be the one holding him. She made a silent vow to herself and to Marcus. She would fight with everything she had to protect him and make up for the years they'd lost. The media trucks lined the hospital parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. Camera crews huddled near the entrance, their equipment ready to capture any movement through the sliding glass doors. Inside, Angela Moore stood at a podium, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. My son isn't the only victim, she said, gripping the edges of the wooden stand. How many other children have suffered because of this broken system? Behind her, a row of parents held photos of their children, all victims of similar schemes. Their stories had emerged like a flood after Marcus's case hit the news. Each tale followed a familiar pattern: vulnerable children, suspicious illnesses, and substantial insurance payouts. Lisa Bradley watched from the back of the room as reporters fired questions at Angela. The past week had seen an explosion of coverage, with major networks picking up the story. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding justice for Marcus and reform of the adoption system. The corporation that threatened my family didn't just silence us, Angela continued. They created a pipeline, moving children from struggling families into homes where they'd be exploited. Outside the hospital, protesters gathered with signs reading, "Children are not commodities and reform foster care now." Local advocacy groups organized rallies, and online petitions gathered thousands of signatures. At their home, Laura Jones sat rigid on her leather couch, watching the coverage with trembling hands. The perfectly maintained facade of their house stood in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding on their flat-screen TV. News anchors dissected their past, displaying photos of previous foster children alongside timelines of suspicious incidents. "We have to comment," Laura whispered to David, her voice cracking. "They're outside again with their cameras." David paced the living room, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from their lawyer. The pressure was mounting. Their neighbors had stopped speaking to them, and their church had asked them to step down from their volunteer positions. Laura's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes or the way her hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup. When another news alert flashed across the TV screen showing Marcus's hospital photo, she dropped the cup, sending ceramic shards and coffee across their pristine white carpet. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice rising hysterically. "Everyone knows. Everyone's looking at us. The grocery store clerk wouldn't even make eye contact with me yesterday." The doorbell rang, making Laura jump. Through the window, they could see reporters clustering around their front yard, microphones extended like accusing fingers. "Mrs. Jones," they called out. "What do you have to say about the allegations? How many children were involved? Did you know about the corporate connection?" Laura pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block out the questions. Her perfect world was crumbling, and all the social graces she'd cultivated over the years couldn't shield her from the truth being exposed in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The media attention had grown beyond just their case. Investigative reporters were digging into the entire network, uncovering connections between adoption agencies, insurance companies, and corporate interests. Each day brought new revelations, new faces, new stories of children who had suffered while people profited from their pain. As Laura watched Angela Moore speak on their television, her composure finally shattered. She sank to her knees among the coffee stains and broken ceramic, her carefully styled hair falling around her face as she began to sob. Detective Ethan Price spread photos and documents across the conference room table, his jaw tight with concentration. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the evidence before him: hospital records, financial statements, and surveillance photos of the Jones family. Something wasn't adding up. "Look at this," he said to Lisa Bradley, who sat beside him reviewing case notes. "Every time we've planned a major move, the Joneses seem to be one step ahead." Lisa leaned forward, frowning at the timeline Price had constructed. "You're right. When we scheduled the surprise inspection of their home, they'd already cleaned everything out," Price finished. "And when we tried to interview their former neighbors, someone had gotten to them first," Lisa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Price rubbed his temples, studying the faces of his team members gathered around the table. Detective Sarah Martinez, typing rapidly on her laptop. Officer James Chen, reviewing phone records. Department Secretary Carol Weber organizing files. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something, a pattern in the dates and times. Every leak corresponded with internal meetings where specific team members were present. Later that afternoon, Lisa hurried through the hospital parking garage, her heels clicking against the concrete. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as footsteps echoed behind her. She quickened her pace, clutching her purse tighter. When she glanced back, she caught a glimpse of a figure ducking behind a concrete pillar. Her heart pounding, she practically ran to her car, fumbling with her keys before finally getting inside and locking the doors. Back at the station, Price methodically reviewed security footage, cross-referencing meeting times with phone records. His eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. He pulled up Carol Weber's personnel file, noting her recent purchases. A new car, expensive jewelry, things far beyond her salary. "Everyone in the conference room now," Price announced over the intercom. As the team assembled, Price remained standing, his expression grim. "We have a leak," he said flatly. "Someone in this room has been feeding information to the Joneses." The tension was palpable as he walked around the table, dropping a stack of phone records in front of Carol Weber. "Care to explain these calls, Carol? All made within minutes of our confidential meetings?" Carol's face drained of color. She glanced nervously at the door, but Officer Chen was already blocking it. "David Jones approached me 3 months ago," she whispered, her hands shaking. "He offered me money, said it would just be small details, nothing important." "Nothing important?" Price's voice rose. "You put a child's life at risk. You compromised months of investigation." Carol broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't know they would hurt Marcus. They seemed so nice, so normal." Price nodded to Officer Chen, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Carol Weber, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit child endangerment." As Chen led Carol away, Price turned to the remaining team members. "From now on, all case information stays in this room. We're going to make this right, for Marcus and every other child these people have hurt." Judge Margaret Keller sat in her chambers, surrounded by stacks of documents that detailed the intricate web connecting Marcus's case to something far more sinister. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she signed the warrant, authorizing a full investigation into Midwest Chemical Corporation. "This goes deeper than we imagined," she told Detective Price, who stood by her desk. "The financial records show Midwest Chemical funneled millions through shell companies directly into New Horizons adoption agency." Lisa Bradley entered the chamber, clutching a fresh manila folder. "Your Honor, we've found more. The agency didn't just place Marcus with the Joneses. They placed at least 6 other children whose parents were involved in environmental lawsuits against Midwest Chemical." The investigation expanded rapidly over the next few days. Corporate offices were searched and computers seized. Angela Moore provided crucial testimony about the threats she'd received years ago, anonymous calls warning her that Marcus would disappear if she didn't drop the lawsuit. But Midwest Chemical fought back hard. Lisa found a black SUV following her home one evening. The next morning, her apartment had been broken into, though nothing was taken. A clear message. At the hospital, security had to remove a man claiming to be a concerned citizen who kept trying to access Marcus's floor. Angela faced similar intimidation. Strange men in suits appeared at her workplace, suggesting that certain matters might be better left alone. But she stood firm, drawing strength from her renewed connection with Marcus. "I lost him once because I was scared," she told Lisa during a quiet moment in Marcus's hospital room. "Never again." Marcus, still recovering but growing stronger each day, became the face of a movement he hadn't intended to start. His story, carefully protected but impossible to completely contain, sparked outrage. Other families began coming forward, parents who'd lost children to the system under suspicious circumstances, all connected to corporate lawsuits. One afternoon, as Lisa sat with Marcus during his physical therapy session, he asked her a question that broke her heart. "Did they pick me because they wanted to hurt my mom?" Lisa chose her words carefully. "They picked you because your mom was trying to protect a lot of people, but they didn't know how brave you are." Marcus nodded, his small face serious. "Other kids got hurt too, didn't they?" "Yes," Lisa admitted. "But because you spoke up, you're helping those kids now." The ripple effect of Marcus's courage spread. 3 former foster children of the Joneses contacted Detective Price. 2 social workers from New Horizons came forward with internal documents. A former Midwest Chemical executive requested whistleblower protection. But with each new revelation came increased danger. Judge Keller ordered round-the-clock security for Marcus's hospital room. Lisa started varying her routes to and from work. Angela moved temporarily into a safe house. One evening, as Lisa reviewed security footage with hospital staff, she caught sight of Laura Jones attempting to enter the hospital through a service entrance, wearing scrubs and carrying a fake ID. The attempt was thwarted, but it sent a chill through everyone involved in the case. Detective Price gathered the core team, Lisa, Judge Keller, and Angela, in a secure conference room. "They're getting desperate," he said, spreading out surveillance photos. "The corporation's stock is plummeting. 3 board members have resigned. They know Marcus's testimony could bring down their entire operation." "But it's not just Marcus anymore," Lisa pointed out. "Every day more people are speaking up. They can't silence everyone." The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows as Marcus sat beside Angela in the witness box. His small hand gripped hers tightly while Judge Keller reviewed the latest evidence against the Joneses. The courtroom was packed with reporters filling the back rows and security officers positioned at every entrance. Marcus fidgeted with the collar of his new blue shirt, a gift from Angela. She squeezed his hand gently, offering silent comfort. The familiar gesture helped calm his racing heart. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the back of the courtroom. A man in a dark jacket burst through the doors, pushing past the bailiff. His hand reached inside his coat as he sprinted toward the witness box. "Nobody move!" the man shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Time seemed to freeze. Angela's maternal instincts kicked in instantly. She wrapped her arms around Marcus, shielding him with her body. The boy trembled against her chest as chaos erupted around them. 2 security officers tackled the assailant mere feet from where Marcus and Angela huddled. The man's head struck the wooden railing with a loud crack and something metallic skittered across the floor, a syringe filled with clear liquid. "Clear the courtroom," Judge Keller commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. She banged her gavel repeatedly as people rushed toward the exits. Detective Price vaulted over the barrier, placing himself between Marcus and the struggling assailant. Lisa Bradley appeared at Angela's side, helping her guide Marcus away from the scene. "Mommy," Marcus whimpered, clinging to Angela's blouse. The words slipped out naturally, born of fear and trust. Tears streamed down Angela's face as she held him closer. "I've got you, baby," she whispered. "I won't let anyone hurt you." The security team subdued the attacker, forcing him into handcuffs while he thrashed and cursed. Detective Price picked up the syringe with gloved hands, carefully placing it in an evidence bag. Judge Keller's face was thunderous as she surveyed the scene. Laura Jones, seated at the defense table, had gone pale. David Jones maintained his composure, but his jaw twitched noticeably. "Your Honor," Detective Price called out, "this man has ties to Midwest Chemical. He's one of their former security contractors." The judge's expression hardened. She gestured for the bailiff to approach and spoke in low, urgent tones. The bailiff nodded and immediately pulled out his phone. Angela kept Marcus close as court officers created a protective circle around them. The boy's breathing came in short gasps, and she rubbed his back soothingly. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're safe now." Judge Keller approached them, her usual stern demeanor softened by concern. "Mrs. Moore, I'm ordering immediate protective custody for both you and Marcus. U.S. Marshals are on their way." "Thank you, Your Honor," Angela replied, her voice shaky but determined. Lisa stepped forward. "I'll help them gather their things from the safe house." "No," Judge Keller said firmly. "You've all been compromised. The Marshals will handle everything from here. New identities, new location, complete witness protection until this case concludes." Marcus looked up at his mother, fear and uncertainty clear in his eyes. "Will we stay together?" "Yes," Judge Keller assured him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You and your mother won't be separated again. You have my word." Within minutes, 4 U.S. Marshals arrived, their presence commanding and professional. They quickly escorted Marcus and Angela through a secure exit, leaving the chaos of the courtroom behind. Detective Price led the team through the Joneses' pristine suburban home. Sunlight filtered through expensive curtains, casting shadows on family photos that now seemed like props. "Check everything," Price ordered. "Every drawer, cabinet, and hidden space." Officers searched methodically. In David's office, they found a false drawer bottom containing damning documents, suspicious bank transfers, inflated insurance policies, and doctored adoption papers. Laura sat rigid on the couch, manicured nails digging into her palms, makeup streaked from crying. When officers emerged with evidence boxes, she broke. "It was David's idea," she sobbed. "He claimed we were helping them. Then came the insurance policies, the accidents, making them sick." "She's hysterical," David snapped from the corner. "Everything was for those kids. We gave them homes." "By poisoning them for insurance money?" Price challenged, brandishing medical records. "You don't understand. We provided stability." "You provided yourself blood money," Price interrupted. "Investigators found a cabinet of illness-inducing chemicals in the kitchen and a notebook behind a bathroom tile detailing treatment schedules and payments." Laura confessed between sobs. "He made me watch them take their medicine, threatening me if I questioned it." Price ordered their arrest for child endangerment, insurance fraud, and adoption fraud. David remained rigid while Laura wept as officers read their rights. News vans gathered outside as police led the handcuffed couple to separate patrol cars. Price knew the adoption agency investigation would follow. His phone buzzed, Lisa confirming Marcus's safety, as investigators continued documenting years of abuse behind the facade of respectability. In the quiet hospital room, Angela sat beside Marcus's bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the child's face as he studied his biological mother with cautious eyes. "Would you like to hear about the time we went to the beach?" Angela asked softly, her voice gentle and inviting. Marcus clutched his stuffed bear closer but nodded slightly. His eyes never left Angela's face as she spoke. "You wore these tiny orange swim trunks with little fish on them," Angela continued, her eyes growing misty with the memory. "Every time a wave came, you'd squeal with joy. You weren't afraid at all." A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's face. "I still like swimming," he whispered. Angela's heart swelled at this small offering of information. "That makes me so happy to hear," she said. "I've missed so many things about you." Tears welled in her eyes as she explained, "When those people threatened us, threatened you, I thought giving you up would keep you safe. But not a day went by that I didn't think about you, didn't try to find you." Marcus's lower lip trembled. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Angela's voice cracked with emotion. "They made sure I couldn't find you. They changed your last name, moved you across state lines. But I never stopped looking, baby. Never." She pulled out an old photo from her purse. Marcus as a toddler, grinning widely at the camera, ice cream smeared across his face. His small fingers reached out to touch the photograph. "That's really me?" "That's you," Angela confirmed. "You loved strawberry ice cream. Still do?" Marcus shook his head. "Chocolate now." "Well, when you're better, maybe we can try both," Angela suggested carefully, not wanting to push too hard. They spent the afternoon sharing small details about their lives. Angela told stories of Marcus's early years while he cautiously shared bits about his current interests, his favorite subjects in school, the books he liked to read. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital room, Marcus grew quiet. Angela noticed his eyes growing heavy with fatigue. "I should let you rest," she said, standing slowly. "Will you—" Marcus hesitated, his voice small. "Will you come back tomorrow?" "Every day," Angela promised. "For as long as you want me here." Marcus nodded, then, in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "Mom?" Angela froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned back to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, baby?" "Thank you for finding me." Angela wanted to rush forward and embrace him but held back, respecting his space. Instead, she smiled through her tears and replied, "Thank you for letting me." In a crowded legislative chamber, dozens of advocates gathered, their passion evident in their determined expressions. Posters bearing Marcus's story and photos of other affected children lined the walls, silent testimonies to a broken system that had failed too many young lives. Judge Margaret Keller stood at the podium, her usual black robes replaced by a conservative navy suit. Her voice carried authority as she addressed the assembled lawmakers and child welfare experts. "The case of Marcus Williams opened our eyes to devastating failures in our foster care system," she said, her words measured but filled with conviction. "But it also showed us the courage of one child who dared to speak the truth." Lisa Bradley sat in the front row, notebook in hand, taking careful notes. The past few months had transformed her from a social worker into an outspoken advocate. She had testified before countless committees, sharing not only Marcus's story but her own role in the system's failures. "We can no longer rely on surface-level background checks," Lisa explained when it was her turn to speak. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear. "The Joneses appeared perfect on paper. We need deeper investigations, regular check-ins, and most importantly, we need to listen to our children." The chamber buzzed with activity as various advocacy groups presented their recommendations. Representatives from the Children's Defense Alliance showed statistics on foster care abuse cases. The Foster Care Reform Coalition outlined specific proposals for enhanced monitoring systems. A series of new bills began taking shape. One required monthly wellness checks by independent medical professionals. Another established a confidential hotline for foster children to report concerns. A third bill mandated thorough financial audits of both foster families and adoption agencies. Judge Keller reviewed each proposal carefully, offering insights from her years on the bench. "These changes won't just protect children," she explained. "They'll also support the many wonderful foster families who truly want to help." Lisa found herself working late into the night with legislative staff, ensuring the language of each bill addressed the real-world challenges she'd witnessed. She thought often of Marcus during these sessions, remembering his courage and speaking up despite his fear. After weeks of deliberation and revision, the package of reforms came up for a vote. The gallery was packed with supporters, including former foster children who had survived their own ordeals. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as lawmakers cast their votes. When the final tally appeared on the electronic board, cheers erupted throughout the chamber. The reforms had passed with overwhelming support. Judge Keller allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction, while Lisa wiped tears from her eyes. The new laws would require extensive background checks, financial monitoring, and regular health screenings for foster children. Adoption agencies would face stricter oversight and regular audits. Most importantly, children would have more opportunities to speak up about their experiences and concerns. As cameras flashed and reporters gathered for statements, Judge Keller stood with Lisa and other advocates. "Today marks a new chapter in protecting our most vulnerable children," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won progress. "These laws ensure that what happened to Marcus Williams will not happen to another child." Marcus Williams sat in the witness stand, his small frame dwarfed by the wooden enclosure. His fingers nervously twisted the hem of his navy blue sweater as he faced the packed courtroom. Angela Moore, his biological mother, sat in the front row, offering silent support with her encouraging smile. "Marcus," the prosecutor, Ms. Reynolds, spoke gently, "can you tell us what happened when you lived with the Joneses?" Marcus's eyes flickered briefly to David and Laura Jones at the defense table. David maintained his stern composure while Laura dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to speak. "They made me drink stuff that tasted weird," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Mrs. Jones would watch me until I finished it all. If I didn't, they'd take away my dinner." The jury leaned forward, hanging on every word. Detective Price, seated near the prosecution table, nodded encouragingly. "What happened after you drank these things?" Ms. Reynolds asked. "I got really sick," Marcus replied, his voice trembling slightly. "My stomach would hurt real bad and sometimes I couldn't get out of bed. But they wouldn't take me to the doctor right away. They said I was being dramatic." The prosecutor displayed medical records on a large screen. "Your Honor, these documents show elevated levels of various toxic substances in Marcus's blood tests." Marcus continued, describing how the Joneses would celebrate each time he got sick enough to go to the hospital. "They seemed happy when the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong," he said. "I heard them talking about insurance money late at night." Laura Jones's composed facade cracked as Marcus spoke about overhearing their conversations. She whispered urgently to her lawyer, but David silenced her with a sharp look. "Did they treat other foster kids the same way?" Ms. Reynolds asked. "Yes," Marcus nodded. "There was Tommy before me. He got really sick too. I never saw him again after they took him to the hospital." The prosecution presented a parade of evidence: financial records showing suspicious insurance payouts, medical records of previous foster children, and testimony from former neighbors who had witnessed concerning behavior. A former nurse testified about the pattern of mysterious illnesses in children under the Joneses' care. The symptoms were consistent with low-dose poisoning, she explained, but they were always just below the threshold that would trigger immediate investigation. Throughout it all, Marcus remained steady, though his voice occasionally quivered. When asked why he finally spoke up during the adoption hearing, his answer brought tears to several jurors' eyes. "I knew if they adopted me, no one would ever look for me again," he said, "and I was scared about what they might do to the next kid after me." The defense tried to paint Marcus as a troubled child with an overactive imagination, but his clear, consistent testimony held firm. The evidence mounted: documents linking the Joneses to the corrupt adoption agency, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, and damning text messages discussing their investment in foster children. Lisa Bradley, watching from her seat behind the prosecution, felt both pride and pain as she watched Marcus's courage on display. She had failed to protect him earlier, but his strength had ultimately exposed a system that needed desperate reform. As Marcus stepped down from the witness stand, he walked past the Joneses. For the first time, he didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he held his head high, his steps steady as he returned to his mother's waiting embrace. The prosecution's closing arguments were devastating, weaving together Marcus's testimony with the mountain of evidence showing years of calculated abuse for financial gain. The defense's attempts to discredit Marcus fell flat against the weight of corroborating evidence and the boy's unwavering testimony. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read: guilty on all counts. David Jones's face remained stone cold, while Laura collapsed into sobs. The headlines splashed across newspapers and television screens: "Corrupt adoption ring leaders arrested." Detective Price stood with his team as federal agents raided the offices of Hope's Promise Adoption Agency, carrying out boxes of evidence and leading handcuffed executives to waiting vehicles. Inside the agency's files, investigators discovered hundreds of cases like Marcus's, children deliberately placed with families willing to participate in insurance fraud schemes. The agency's director, Patricia Henderson, had maintained a network of corrupt doctors, social workers, and foster parents who profited from children's suffering. Angela Moore sat in a community center meeting room, surrounded by other parents who had lost their children to the corrupt system. Her voice carried strength as she shared her story. "They used our children as commodities," she said, her hands clasped tightly. "But now we're taking back control. We're building a support network for everyone affected by this tragedy." The room was filled with nodding heads and determined faces. Angela had partnered with legitimate children's advocacy groups to create a comprehensive support program. They offered counseling services, legal aid, and educational resources to help families rebuild their lives. Marcus attended therapy twice a week with Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. In their sessions, he used art and play therapy to process his experiences. His drawings, once dark and chaotic, gradually began to show brighter colors and hopeful scenes. "Look, Mom," he said one day, holding up a picture of two figures holding hands under a sunny sky. "That's us." Angela's eyes welled with tears as she hugged him close. These moments of normal mother-son interaction were precious, healing balm for both their wounded hearts. The compensation fund established for the victims helped provide stability for affected families. Angela used part of their settlement to create a cozy bedroom for Marcus, filled with books and toys he chose himself. His favorite spot became a reading nook by the window, where he often curled up with his stuffed bear, now a symbol of his courage rather than his fear. Lisa Bradley, still deeply involved in Marcus's case, worked alongside Angela to reform the foster care system. Together, they testified before state legislative committees, pushing for stricter oversight and better protections for vulnerable children. "Each child deserves to feel safe and loved," Angela told the legislators. "What happened to Marcus and countless others cannot happen again." Marcus began to smile more often, especially during weekly visits with Lisa, who had become like family. He no longer flinched at unexpected movements or hid his feelings. In therapy, he learned to express his emotions and trust his instincts. "You're so brave," Angela would tell him each night as she tucked him in. "I'm proud to be your mom." And Marcus, finally feeling secure in his mother's love, would smile back and say, "I love you too, Mom." These simple words, once impossible to imagine, now came naturally, marking each small step in their journey toward healing. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Marcus stood at the entrance of Riverside Elementary School, his new backpack feeling lighter than the weight of fears he'd carried for so long. Angela squeezed his hand gently, her presence steady and reassuring. "Remember what Dr. James said," Angela reminded him softly. "Just take it one moment at a time." Marcus nodded, his eyes taking in the cheerful murals decorating the school walls and the sound of children laughing on the playground. This school felt different from the others, warmer somehow, more welcoming. Ms. Thompson, his new fourth-grade teacher, greeted them at the classroom door. She had kind eyes and a warm smile that reminded Marcus of Lisa. "Welcome to our class, Marcus," she said, kneeling to his level. "We're so happy to have you join us." Throughout the morning, Marcus discovered small comforts in his new environment. His desk was next to a window where sunlight streamed in, making patterns on his notebooks. The boy sitting next to him, Kevin, shared his colored pencils without being asked. At recess, a group of kids invited him to join their basketball game. When Angela picked him up after school, Marcus's eyes were brighter than they'd been in months. "Mom," he said, the word now flowing naturally from his lips, "can we get ice cream to celebrate?" They sat in the local ice cream parlor, Marcus with his chocolate chip mint cone and Angela with her vanilla sundae. She watched as he described his day, his hands moving animatedly as he talked about the science project they'd started and the funny story Ms. Thompson had read to the class. "You know what, Marcus?" Angela said, reaching across the table to wipe a spot of ice cream from his chin. "Every time you try something new, Every time you share your thoughts or make a friend, you're showing just how strong you are." Marcus considered this, licking his ice cream thoughtfully. "Does being strong mean I can't be scared sometimes?" "No, baby," Angela replied. "Being strong means feeling scared but trying anyway. And you're doing that every single day." That evening, they created a special space on their living room wall they called the Victory Wall. Angela hung up Marcus's first school assignment, a creative writing piece that had earned a gold star. Next to it, she placed a photo of them together at the ice cream parlor, their faces close and smiling. "This is just the beginning," Angela told him, adjusting the frame. "We'll fill this wall with all your achievements, big and small." Marcus stood back, admiring their handiwork. The setting sun cast a warm glow through the window, illuminating his face as a genuine smile spread across it. Not the hesitant, guarded expression he'd worn for so long, but a real, joyful smile that reached his eyes and lit up his whole face. It was the kind of smile that spoke of hope, of healing, of a child finally feeling safe enough to just be a child. The lights in the television studio dimmed as the documentary, Lost and Found: Marcus's Story, began to air on national television. The camera focused on Marcus, now 9 years old, sitting beside his mother Angela on a comfortable couch in their living room. His eyes, once filled with fear, now sparkled with quiet confidence. "I was scared all the time," Marcus said, his voice steady as he spoke to the interviewer. "But Mom taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." Angela wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders, drawing him close. The documentary showed photos of their journey, Marcus in the hospital, the courtroom scenes, and finally, their reunion. Interspersed were interviews with Detective Price, Lisa Bradley, and Judge Keller, each sharing their perspective on the case that had changed the child welfare system. When Marcus spoke up, he didn't just save himself, Lisa Bradley explained on screen. He saved countless other children who might have fallen victim to the same scheme. The documentary revealed shocking statistics about child exploitation in the foster care system, but it also highlighted the positive changes that had emerged from Marcus's case. New legislation, named Marcus's Law, had been passed in several states, requiring stricter background checks and monitoring of foster families. Social media exploded with reactions as the documentary aired. Justice for Marcus and Daughter Protect Our Children trended nationwide. Parents, activists, and lawmakers joined the conversation, sharing their own stories and calling for further reforms. Angela's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support and requests for interviews, but she remained focused on what mattered most: her son's healing and their growing bond. Later that evening, as they sat together on their front porch swing, Marcus looked up at the stars twinkling in the night sky. The documentary had finished airing an hour ago, and a peaceful quiet had settled over their neighborhood. "Mom," Marcus said softly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "All those people watching our story, do you think it will help other kids?" Angela squeezed his hand gently. "It already has, baby. Your courage showed people the truth. Remember what Judge Keller said? Sometimes it just takes one voice to start a change." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, processing her words. He remembered how scared he'd been to speak up at first, how the Joneses had made him feel like no one would believe him. But people had believed him. They'd listened, and they'd acted. "The lady on the news said 3 more adoption agencies got shut down because of our story," Marcus continued, pride creeping into his voice. "And Lisa told me they're helping other kids find their real families too." Angela's heart swelled with love and pride for her son. Despite everything he'd been through, he still thought about helping others. She watched as he traced patterns in the evening sky with his finger, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "We made a difference, didn't we?" Marcus asked, turning to look at his mother with eyes that held wisdom beyond his years. Angela felt tears of pride well up in her eyes as she nodded, pulling him close. Her son, who had endured so much, had become a beacon of hope for others. The tears spilled over as she held him, grateful for their second chance and the positive change they'd helped create. Angela Moore gripped the podium before the crowd at the state capitol, where supporters held signs demanding foster care reform. 3 years ago, she began, Corruption took my son from me. I speak today for every parent and child betrayed by a system meant to protect them." The crowd fell silent while advocacy group representatives sat behind her, wearing blue ribbons for reform. The Joneses weren't just bad foster parents. They represent a system prioritizing profit over children. "These 50 stories prove it," she said, lifting a stack of papers. "Real children, real suffering." Social worker Lisa Bradley watched supportively from the stage, having helped craft new protection policies. Angela outlined their demands: surprise inspections, oversight committees, better background checks, and attention to children's complaints. The crowd cheered as signs waved. In the front row, 9-year-old Marcus watched his mother proudly. "The Child Protection and Foster Care Reform Act will create safeguards, increase vetting funds, and establish an investigation task force," she announced as advocacy leaders stood behind her. "Laws aren't enough. We must see foster children as lives to protect, not cases to manage." Marcus fidgeted with his tie in the Children's Hope Center auditorium. Amid decorative banners and chattering crowds, his hands twisted nervously in his lap. Angela whispered reassuringly, touching his hand. Though Marcus nodded, his eyes revealed his anxiety. He wore a new navy suit she'd bought for the event. Lisa Bradley leaned in from his other side. "You don't have to speak. Being here is enough." The lights dimmed as Sarah Chen, the Children's Voice Foundation director, approached the podium. She spoke about courage and listening to children. "We honor a young man who exposed corruption and protected countless children," Sarah announced. "Marcus Williams proved the smallest voice can create the biggest change." At his name, Marcus rose shakily and walked to the stage as applause surrounded him. Sarah knelt, presenting a Crystal Star Award for exceptional courage and being a voice for the voiceless. Marcus studied the award, seeing Angela's proud tears, Detective Price's thumbs up, and Judge Keller's approving nod. Unlike his courtroom teddy bear, this weight made him stand taller. After the ceremony, a young girl approached with her foster mother. "Did you really help stop bad people?" "Sometimes grown-ups do wrong things," Marcus replied softly. "But good people help if you tell the truth." More families shared stories of hope inspired by his case. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus walked out with Angela. "Maybe I can help other kids like me someday," he whispered to his mother. The waves lapped at the shore in a peaceful rhythm. Marcus stood at the water's edge, toes sunk in wet sand as foam touched his feet. The summer sun warmed him while a breeze rustled his grown-out curls. Angela watched from her striped blanket, marveling at her son's transformation. He seemed taller, unburdened, the trauma lifting from his shoulders. Marcus jumped a wave with a delighted squeal that made Angela beam. These were the joyful sounds she'd longed for during their years apart. "Mom, watch this!" He attempted a cartwheel in shallow water, stumbling but emerging with laughter. Tears formed as Angela recalled the scared boy from last year's hospital visit. Through therapy, love, and time, Marcus had healed remarkably. Though nightmares and anxiety lingered, they diminished monthly. He chased seagulls in soaked red trunks, water glistening on his skin. Stopping to study sea glass, he showed the same curiosity she remembered from his toddler days. Their year of reuniting revealed new discoveries: his preferences, mannerisms, his distinctive laugh. Angela treasured each detail, compensating for lost time. A large wave startled him into giggles. He turned toward the blanket, eyes bright with excitement. "Mom!" he called, running to her with open arms dripping wet, his smile full of hard-won trust and love. If you enjoyed the story of Marcus Williams, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.